With a mission to close the gender wage gap in Ontario, the Pay Equity Office works to make the world a more equitable place for women to work, live, and thrive. Ontario's Pay Equity Office and What She Said have partnered for a three-part series on a woman's worth. Last month, Commissioner Kadie Ward joined me to discuss the care economy and how we undervalue it. You can find more on that over on whatshesaidtalk.com to listen to the interview and read a more in-depth article on what it is and how we can change the way we value unpaid labor. In this third segment with Commissioner Kadie Ward, we are discussing the gender wage gap and how to close it for good. Welcome back, Kadie.
Thank you for having me.
It's one of these things, it's that classic protest sign. Why are we still talking about this?
Good question.
Why are we?
I'm going to lead with some good news. The gender wage gap is closing. It's not closing evenly. We know that for women of color, non-binary, racialized, all the intersectionality, Indigenous, disabled, the wage gap is closing at a much slower rate. But in general, we're seeing, since 1997, I was looking at some data, every single province across Canada has closed the gender wage gap between 5 to 13%. So it's closing. It's closing for a lot of reasons. Which helps us understand why it's persisting. And 30% of the wage gap is explainable. We can understand it by, women take time off because of care responsibilities, or they tend to work in part-time labor, or they're taking more sporadic work because of, unpaid care responsibilities that we talked about last month. But 70% of the gender wage gap remains unexplained. And this is the unexplained part that is the biggest challenge. It is absolutely rooted in biases and rooted in stereotypes that we have about women's, quote unquote, women's work and how we value that work. So, we've gone together, we've talked about just how women have clustered in our first segment together, clustered in certain types of work, and then that work is undervalued and therefore paid less. And that work tends to be, gendered, like it's domestic or it's care, things that we think women should just do. And then, women have to take on a significant percentage of unpaid care work, right? Women around the world spend on average more than twice as much time on unpaid and domestic work than men, which obviously impacts their ability to participate in the economy and get paid work. So, when we talk about all of this now, we move into, well, let's level the playing field. Let's move into a space where we actually confront those biases that allow that 70% of the unexplained gender wage gap to exist.
So has the pandemic set us back?
Good question. Materially, it's put women back in terms of labor market participation. And we know over time that labor market participation contributes to the gender wage gap. From 2018 to 2021, we did see about a 1%, actually a 2% close in the gender wage gap in Ontario, 1% close average overall. But that is also, a tricky stat because in some ways, men and men's wages are becoming lower because advanced manufacturing and very high paying jobs are going away. Unionization rates are just decreasing. So men's pay is also coming down. So when we see an average pay in general coming down, the gap is going to close. So, but that is to say, progress is being made. With COVID, the biggest concern is women's exodus from the workforce. We saw women's participation drop to the lowest it's been in 30 years. And it's bouncing back, but it's coming back slower than men's. And this is linked to just responsibilities outside of work and the kind of social, cultural, even religious ideologies about where women belong and what type of work women should be doing.
We've talked a lot in the past year on this show about pay transparency. And, when employers list jobs, they often don't list what the job is paying, which can be used against who's ever applying. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a big question, and employers have many reasons when they talk about pay transparency. It's competitive, it's all of these things, right? The Pay Equity Act is one tool, and pay equity legislation is a tool that addresses the gender wage gap from a point of view. It does require transparency in pay because when you apply the Pay Equity Act, we look at compensation data across a company, and we compare jobs that are primarily done by women with jobs that are primarily done by men, and we look at the equal value of those work. So it becomes transparent when you apply the Pay Equity Act within a company. This is something that's happening organically, right? Sites like Glassdoor and other organizations are just starting to do it. So I think it's becoming a tool that companies see is important for them in their competitive recruitment process. And it's a remedy, women and men listening to the show, you can use the the Pay Equity Act to get to transparency, because a key part of the act is analyzing all compensation data. So it becomes very clear who's getting paid for what type of work and what the value of that work is. This is what our focus is on addressing the systemic devaluation of jobs that women are doing. And so that varies by company, right? A secretary in one company might be male dominated, it might be female dominated in another. It's generally a female dominated sector, clerical work. But we look at the individual company and what's happening in there in terms of their compensation structures and whether it's equitable or not.
And one of the things, that I think is encouraging, though, is Ontario is really a leader in pay equity.
It is. Thank you for mentioning that. We were one of the first jurisdictions globally to introduce a Pay Equity Act that applies to both the public and private sector. So we did see a few earlier acts, but they only apply to public sector employees. Ours is blanketed to public and private. If there's 10 plus employees, it applies. So, we have one of the most rigorous pay equity acts out there. The OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, just recently put out a report on pay equity globally. And I was looking at the criteria they were measuring. And Ontario's is one of the more stricter in terms of its application and in terms of the way that it is able to enforce and follow up on companies actually complying with the act. It's a legal requirement in Ontario.
Okay, so if somebody is, listening to this and they're thinking that the company they're working for, they've applied for, is not following the law, what is their recourse?
Well, they are able to apply for an application for an investigation through the Pay Equity Office, so payequity.gov.on.ca, and that's anonymous. So they can fill that in without any knowledge and of who's putting the application. And we also have provisions in the act, and this is an important point. We have provisions in the act that protect the applicant. So if there's some kind of discipline or they're dismissed, say, mysteriously a few months after making the inquiry, they can come back and make an application on unjust dismissal. So we protect the individuals who are coming to us to make this investigation, and we do it on their behalf anonymously.
That's incredible. That's really good news for people who want to share, but maybe afraid or hesitant. What's coming up? Anything we should know about that you're working on that's going to continue to close this gap?
Sure. We continue to strive to level the paying field. And we spoke earlier when we launched a 6-part series called Level the Paying Field, and folks can go to levelthepayingfield.ca because you hear that analogy all the time, level the playing field in terms of sports. And there would never be a scenario where you would watch, say, a hockey game or a football game or a soccer game and the playing field would be tilted. Like that just would never happen. So we should get there, and that's the point within in pay and compensation. It should also be level. So that's a 6-part series where women and men, if they want to get educated on the various facets of how inequality, how technology, how gendering certain jobs has led to wider discrimination in the workplace. They can listen to that series on wherever they get their podcasts. They can also listen and watch conversations happening. We're focused on education and outreach to educate men and women, all intersectional identities in there, about what is a gender wage gap and how we can work collectively to close it.
Kadie, as usual, this was incredibly informative, and I want people to know that you also do a deeper dive on the blog, way more information. People can catch all 3 of these interviews on whatshesaidtalk.com. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful exploring, a woman's worth with you. So thank you for the opportunity.